Well, good evening and welcome to this evening's forum. I'm Professor Joe Kalt, a professor here at the Kennedy School, and it's my pleasure to moderate this forum this evening. We have one regrettable announcement that you may notice as a result of only 3 name placards and 3 chairs here. Unfortunately, Senator Reid seems to think his job in Washington is quite important because they're holding a vote scheduled for 9 o'clock tonight on appropriations, omnibus appropriations, to which Frank Lautenberg has attached an amendment dealing with the EPA funding, and apparently the vote will be 50 to 50 or approximately something like that. And as a result, Senator Reid is unable to join us. We thought Harvard was a better draw, but he apparently takes both his job and his political future quite seriously. But be that as it may, we do have 2 very eminent individuals who have spent much of their professional careers dealing with tonight's topic. The Endangered Species Act in the narrow, of course, is under debate in Congress, the so-called reauthorization debate. But even more broadly around the world, of course, issues of species protection, biodiversity, are front and center for policymakers, not only in the United States, but in developing countries and developed countries around the world. The debates often, of course, have at their extremes debates over ends. That is, at their extremes, the debates over species preservation, biodiversity, etc., are debates over fundamental values as to the appropriate way by which human society should be operated and relate to their natural environments. As you move away from the extremes, tempers can still run hot because even where there's agreement or a close agreement on values, there's often tremendous disagreement over the means to achieving the values. And much of the debate here in the United States is focused right now on exactly that. That is, the appropriate means for governing the preservation of species, protecting biodiversity, and regulating human interaction with the biosystem in which we live. Well, tonight's speakers are going to address both the broad and the narrow issues associated with endangered species protection, and both have long histories of professional work related to environmental policy in general and issues of species protection, biodiversity, and related matters. And I'll begin by introducing Professor E.O. Wilson, and he'll speak first, and then following that, I'll introduce our second guest tonight, Alston Chase. Professor Wilson is the Pellegrino University professor at Harvard. He's got degrees from the University of Alabama and from Harvard. And of course, as many of you know, his research interests have spanned a very broad range from evolutionary biology, the biology of social insects, sociobiology, to ethical philosophy. Of particular relevance to tonight's topic, he's the author of The Diversity of Life and The Naturalist, as well as many other books and hundreds of articles related to his field of biology. He's widely recognized as a founder of sociobiology and modern biodiversity studies. He serves on the boards of directors of the Nature Conservancy, the American Museum of Natural History, the New York Botanical Garden, and the World Wildlife Fund. He's received many medals and honors, including the National Medal of Science. He's also won 2 Pulitzer Prizes, one on human nature and one for his book, The Ants. It's our pleasure tonight to have Professor Wilson speak, and we welcome you and look forward to your remarks.
Thank you so much for coming. I realize that this is a play of Hamlet without the prince, but we will try to do as well as we can. I appreciate the opportunity, and let me begin by noting that in the great array of environmental problems that face a burgeoning human population, there are 2 great categories. One is the deterioration of the physical environment, the ones that get most of the attention. toxic pollution, closure or opening of the ozone, the warming of the environment of the atmosphere by the greenhouse effect and so on. These can all be put in one category, physical deterioration of the world, and our hands are upon that homeostat, and we can turn it up and down and we can reverse it. Radically different is the loss of biodiversity, which is irreversible. And it is also unique in that the maintenance of it and the research behind it and the practical applications that can be found by conducting those enterprises offers great benefits for humanity that simply restoring or reversing physical deterioration does not. Let me begin by defining biodiversity as the creation. It is all of the hereditary variation found in life on Earth. Biologists recognize three main levels of biological organization in which it can be measured. Genes within populations, then the populations themselves, particularly those that can be distinguished as species. And this is where we can do our most quantitative studies, because in most cases species can be clearly defined sufficiently to do so. And then ecosystems that the species compose. Tonight I'll begin by giving you an audit of the biodiversity of the world and then of the United States, and then I'll give you some specific information on how rapidly that biodiversity is disappearing and where it is disappearing. You have before you a diagram that I put together with the help of specialists 10 years ago, which indicates that about 1.4 million species of plants, animals, and microorganisms have been discovered to the present time. Later estimates have moved that up to 1.5 or 1.6 in that vicinity. You could best remember it as 1.5. 1.5 million species have been described by science. The actual number of species on Earth is unknown. This is a relatively little explored planet. The number we do not know to the nearest order of magnitude. It is variously estimated to lie somewhere between 10 million and 100 million species. Most of the organisms, as you can see here, of the different kinds of organisms are in fact very small organisms, insects in particular. When we get around to actually exploring the bacterial world, then that segment, which is still a relatively small sliver of 4,000 species, will expand, I believe, astronomically to change the whole composition of that diagram. Here you have this represented as the species scape, in which the size of a representative organism is made proportional to the number of known species in it. Thus, the insects loom like a Goodyear blimp above a nearly microscopic elephant representing the 4,000 species of elephants. This puts things in perspective in terms of biodiversity. How much biodiversity is there in the United States? Well, once again, I've just recently gotten together an estimate, and I figure it to be somewhere more than 100,000, at least 100,000, probably not more than 130,000 species known in the United States of plants, animals, and microorganisms. My guess would be that this being one of the better known parts of the world, that may be no more than doubled by the time we have complete biotic surveys of the United States. How fast is that biodiversity disappearing? You have before you the just released figures from the Nature Conservancy, which is based on the Natural Heritage Database, which is the best available in the United States. These figures are well supported by individual state surveys and individual monographs by individual specialists working on various plants, animals, and microorganisms. And in general, what you see is the green column representing the proportion of species in different groups, which range in this case from in the plants from ferns across to the flowering plant. Those are the species that are not in any stage of threat. The columns to the left are the ones that are either extinct or in some degree of endangerment. There's the animal groups. Notice as we go from mammals over toward the right that the most endangered groups in the United States are the aquatic. That's a little known fact about endangered species in the United States. They're usually or disproportionately in groups that are aquatic and not well known in general natural history reports. The number of species that have gone extinct known in the principally studied groups, the ones where we have a sound database, within those groups, as the one shown here, is 1.4%. Mostly within the last 100 years, 1.4% of all the species have gone extinct. 33% are in some state of endangerment. Even those that are not in some state of endangerment have undergone drastic shrinkage of their ranges and reduction of, I'm speaking of the species now, reduction of a diversity of genes within the species. That should be borne in mind. Where is the extinction going on? I don't know how clearly you can see that, but I can describe what you are looking at. This is a county by county record in the United States of numbers of threatened species that are found locally. And the darker the color shown here, the greater the number of endangered species. So the crimson red there is what we call the hot spots. The hot spots, where there are the largest numbers of threatened ecosystems with the largest number of threatened species within them, are found in just a few places in the United States. Very widely, as you can see, through the Southwest, particularly in the mountains and some of the pristine desert areas, Southern California. Florida, particularly the sand hills country of Central Florida, and the extinction capital of the United States, which is Hawaii. This is an important point to bear in mind in considering the implications of the Endangered Species Act and its modification, namely that most of the United States is not going to be affected by it. And even within the hotspot regions of the United States, only pinpoints of areas are going to be significantly concerned with it. In a recent study made by Conservation International, following up on a similar study of the database made by the International Council for Bird Preservation in England, it was determined that worldwide, if only 1.4% of the world's land surface containing the hottest of the hot spots, places like Madagascar, New Caledonia, Andes, and so on, were to be preserved, it would achieve a temporary reprieve for 20 to 25% of the various vertebrate group species, those that are most endangered, and up to 40% of the plant species. So right away, you can see that with better information, we could hope to design better legislation to protect species and better international protocols to do the same thing on a global basis. I would like to mention in passing, too, with reference to the Endangered Species Act, that the actual damage that the practice of the Endangered Species Act since 1973 has caused is easily exaggerated. In the last 5-year cycle for which we have records released by the GAO, 1987 to 1991, we find that 18,200 200 cases were examined that might be in conflict with the Endangered Species Act. 90% of those were immediately dismissed. That was just an informal review. 181, or 1% of the 18,000, resulted in a jeopardy decision, meaning that some modification of the development or land use was needed to protect endangered species, 1%. And of those, 23 in a 5-year period resulted in a blocking of an actual piece of land development or land use. That's 1/10 of 1%. So I hope we'll keep this in mind, and then when you compare it with the existence of better and better information concerning hotspots, and also the possibility of concentrating on endangered ecosystems within those hotspots, we may have the basis for a win-win set of solutions that satisfies the desire of Americans to protect their sacred right of private ownership and use of their lands on the one side, and the national long-term need and desire to protect our natural heritage for all future generations on the other side. I might add in passing, too, that several methods of estimation have come to an agreement that the rate of species extinction worldwide is somewhere on the order of 100 to 1,000 times greater than it was before the coming of humanity. Here is one of the many examples of mass extinctions that can be cited, this one from the United States. The original Hawaiian bird fauna, there were no ants in Australia, in Hawaii before coming of man. We brought them there. The original Hawaiian bird fauna comprised 100 species approximately. The Hawaiians, the original Hawaiians, after setting shore around 400 AD, managed to eliminate about half of them. That's a very common phenomenon around the world. When new human populations arrive for these faunas, particularly the larger animals, to be largely eliminated. Since the 1700s, another quarter has been eliminated. So Hawaii now is left with about 25 of its native species, some of which are shown here, many of which are endangered, probably most are endangered. Some are on the brink of extinction, and in fact cannot be recovered. They are among what biologists call the living dead. As an area is reduced of a habitat, like a rainforest, a lake, a river system, a patch of long grass prairie, inevitably the number of species in that habitat declines. Hundreds of studies, independent studies of different groups of organisms in different environments have provided curves like the one here for the reptiles and amphibians of the West Indies. The number of species found in a habitat for an indefinite period of time that's in some degree of stability increases as in almost all cases between the 6th and the 3rd root of the area. A typical middle value, very common, is the 4th root, a slope on a log-log plot of 0.25. And that translates to a much more easily remembered rule, that middle value. 90% reduction in area results in time in a reduction of 1/2 of the species. You go to 50%. That decline has been measured over and over again in different systems, and there is no doubt about it. Now, increasingly, studies are being made in which the actual extinction process following reduction of the area is followed. And we know, to some extent, with the best data, again in the birds, the rate at which that decline occurs. In reserves left that are between 1 square kilometer and 20 square kilometers, for example, birds around the world in different habitats decline in something approaching a negative exponential curve at the rate that 10 to 40% of the species, depending on the area, are lost within the first 100 years. And the largest number of species are lost very quickly because this does sort of go like exponential decay. Here, for example, to take an example of this phenomenon of the national parks of North America, they are islands in areas of human disturbance of varying degrees. They vary enormously in area, and the mammals within these have been disappearing. Overall, the mammals have disappeared locally in these national parks, as shown here for the cumulative data, so that the average decline is 10% within 100 years in the numbers of species of mammals. In accordance with the idea that these species are in equilibrium, that you start with a rough equilibrium and you approach a new equilibrium, are the data, as expected from the theory of species equilibrium, that the number of species declines most rapidly in the smaller islands, and that has proven to be the case. Do not confuse, as beginning ecology students do, and as some journalists and philosophers do, that in ecological stasis with species equilibrium. Species equilibrium, as conceived here, is dynamical and occurs in a constantly changing natural environment. Here is the history of the decline of the American forest in the eastern part of the country. It went down at the time of the mid-century to the 19th century to 40% of cover, stayed there for a long period of time, and is now beginning to come up, unfortunately, to a large extent in monocultures of pine and other trees, but not always. In New England is a real success story. According to the theory of equilibrium and these area species curves that we have already in place from elsewhere, the number of extinct species caused by that habitat should be 5. The number that has actually gone extinct is 5. That's embarrassingly close. I would remind you that there have been 5 great extinction spasms before the coming of humanity through the last 450 million years, and in each case this took 10 million years. It took 10 million years of evolution to replace it. How much time do I have, Mr. Moderator? 5 minutes? 5 minutes. Enough time to recite what I have learned are the 3 stages of denial concerning species extinction. The first is, it doesn't matter. Humanity is just another cause of extinction. Evolution will replace the species we are extinguishing. As I've just shown, yes, in 10 million years, if we stop what we're doing right now, as I said, the species extinction rate is approximately 100 to 1,000 times faster than it was before humanity came, and that amount faster than the species are generated. If you are expending your bank account 100 to 1,000 times faster than what you're putting in, you will go bankrupt, and that's what's happening. The second stage of denial is that scientists will fix it. They'll find ways of preserving the species even as the ecosystems vanish. We'll put the animals in zoos, for example. The total capacity, as Bill Conway of the Bronx Zoo has estimated, of all the zoos in the world, if committed totally to the preservation of endangered vertebrates, is 2,000 species. The number of species of vertebrates in the world known, land vertebrates in these groups, is 24,000. As far as keeping fertilized eggs or embryos in liquid nitrogen and then putting them together in an ecosystem later to reconstitute the ecosystem, forget it. That's like unscrambling eggs with 2 spoons. The third stage of denial is, well, maybe all that is hopeless, but can't we afford to lose a quarter or half a species? That brings us then to the value of species. And I like to a risk of being somewhat pedantic, note three areas in which three reasons we cannot afford to lose species indefinitely, and preferably no more species. The first is utilitarian. It is now massively documented and how we can turn to the natural species quickly for new pharmaceuticals, cancer-curing agents, new forms of antibiotics and the like, and products that range from new types of crops, genes to put in existing crops and so on. The second is ecosystem services. Recent studies have shown that, experimental studies have shown that the greater the biodiversity, the greater the number of species, the greater the resistance of those ecosystems to stress, such as drought, and the greater their productivity. And finally, there is the argument from human values, basic human values. We are destroying the creation. Is this something that we want to be remembered for the hundreds and thousands of generations that will do without the species that we're carelessly allowing to go? That's the genome, the complete genetic map of a small virus. A typical species from an amoeba to a bird contains 1 million to 10 million times more genetic letters in its code. It is a masterpiece of evolution, exquisitely adapted to the environment in which it lives, fitted together beautifully with other species in its ecosystem. Its loss should be regarded as a tragedy. Any species loss should be regarded as a tragedy by humanity. And I guess that's the most value-laden judgment that I'll make tonight. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Our next speaker, Alston Chase, is a renowned author on environmental issues, known for shaking up and more sharply focusing the basic precepts of philosophy and ethics that underlie much of the environmental debates of today. He's the author of Playing God in Yellowstone, The Destruction of America's First National Park, and most recently, the author of In a Dark Wood, The Fight Over Forests and the Rising Tyranny of Ecology. He's a syndicated columnist on environmental affairs, and notwithstanding this career as an environmental author, scholar, his first career was as a philosophy professor. He has degrees from Harvard and Oxford and Princeton, and has held many positions related to environmental affairs. He's been the chairman of the board of the Yellowstone National Park Library and Museum Association and Yellowstone Institute, and was the founding executive director of the Northern Rockies Foundation. We look forward to your remarks, Alston.
Thank you very much. It's very nice to be here. I think that I was first aware, you mentioned, Professor Call, in your opening remarks about how hotly debated environmental subjects are. I first learned that about 15 years ago when in 1980, I'd written a book about a critique of higher education, in which essentially I'd said that the American colleges and universities were going to pot, and it was jeopardizing the future of a generation of Americans. And the book fell stillborn from the press, as David Hume once remarked about his treatise on human understanding. A couple of years later, I wrote an article in the Atlantic Monthly that argued that National Park Service mismanagement was jeopardizing the future of 200 grizzly bears in that park, and that caused congressional hearings, and the article has been reprinted about 25 or so some odd publications. So it was then that I learned that I don't know whether I should infer that means we care more about the grizzly bears than about our children, but in any case, it did indicate to me just how hot a political subject the environment is. It's sometimes very, very difficult to stand in the middle, as I'm trying to do on some of these issues, and sort out what appear the reasonable position in the middle. Tonight, I want to take a slightly different approach to the subject than Professor Wilson. I wanted to discuss with you the Endangered Species Act and then go from there to some rather more general questions that I have about U.S. Preservation policy and about the Endangered Species Act in particular and preservation policy in general. I'm actually a little bit more optimistic about the political situation today than I was. The environmental movement is I've sometimes referred to this as the Dunkirk phenomenon, that Great Britain had its finest hour shortly after Dunkirk. They did best when their backs were to the wall, and I think the environmental community is somewhat the same way. During the Reagan years, when the environmental community was felt itself under siege, and many people felt it was under siege, was a period of enormous growth for the environmental movement. By the latter part of the 1980s, the environmental movement was actually losing losing membership, and having some groups were having problems with sufficient funds and so on. And then along came the Republican Congress of 1994. And once again, the environmental community has found itself with its backs to the wall, and it's responded as it did, I think, in the early Reagan years. In fact, we see exactly that reaction on the part of the Republicans, who came in thinking that they were going to take the Endangered Species Act and radically change it. And then they quickly saw that they ran into a buzzsaw of opposition, and they've had to some degree to draw in their horns. I think that as a consequence, what we're seeing now, and we'll see in this coming year, is that in fact, as the Republicans have drawn in their horns, and the environmental community is, on one hand, stronger than it perhaps felt itself a year and a half ago, or a year and a quarter ago, nevertheless, perhaps chastened by the experience, we might actually see some constructive, in fact, I think we already are seeing constructive debate on the Endangered Species Act, and a growing consensus about it. I say until 1994, the supporters of the Act pretty much believed that it shouldn't be changed at all, that it was perfect. The Republicans who came in, many of them did indeed want to gut the Act. I think that now it would be true enough to say that most people would agree that the Endangered Species Act represents some of the highest aspirations of American people. That the goal of the Act to preserve biodiversity is one which is shared by an overwhelming majority of the Americans, and the question is now focusing more increasingly on what on means to the end. Has it proved to be, and are there ways to make it more effective in achieving these ends? And I think it's there that we see, for the first time, a growing consensus, that the Act has had problems and can be made to work better. There's been no question about the Act that it has managed to protect a lot of land from developers. But that's a very different thing from the question of whether it's actually achieved its stated goal of preserving biodiversity. One could argue that if the Act had not been in place, that there would have been a considerably more biodiversity loss, and it's difficult to know how to measure that. But we can say, for example, that as I say, this is part of what I see as a consensus. In 1988, the General Accounting Office noted that of the 965 species that were listed as endangered or threatened at that time, 2 of them had recovered as a result of the Act. In 1991, the Inspector General of the Interior Department reported that 34 species had gone extinct while awaiting listing. By 1992, the President's Office Environmental Quality announced that, reported that 9,000 creatures remained at risk, and that simply reviewing their status would take 50 years and cost $4.6 billion. The thoughtful critique of the Act by Mark L. Plummer and Charles C. Mann noted, and this was taken from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife figures, that between 1973 and 1993, of the 721 animals listed, plants and animals listed as endangered, and 134 which were grandfathered into the Act in 1973, only one, the American alligator, could be claimed to have been rescued as a result of the Act. Even the Fish and Wildlife Service reported that only a handful could be claimed to be rescued as a result of the Act. By any standards, this was a disappointing performance. And the question is, why is this, and what can be done about it? One of the building consensus I see is the recognition that the Act has provided perverse incentives for preservation of species. The typical situation, one where, or rather, Professor Wilson would suggest that it doesn't happen too often. I would suggest that in the last 4 years, 5 years, it's been far more frequent. But in any case, it doesn't take many examples of this kind to scare a lot of landowners, and that is that the landowner who is conscientious, who, let's say, owns 200 acres of forest, and carefully maintains that, and does only some selective cutting, and as a result of maintaining the habitat in a way that is, let's say, conducive to propagation of northern spotted owls, which are a listed species as threatened species in the Pacific Northwest, find that they actually, by that his actions, has attracted owls to his land, to his forest, may then find himself in a situation where the Fish and Wildlife Service comes in and says, you now have critical habitat of the northern spotted owl, and we won't let you cut another tree down. This is another example of a perverse incentive under 4D, a ruling of the Fish and Wildlife Service a couple of years ago. In southern Oregon, they established, the Fish and Wildlife Service established certain areas and in it, they said that of the landowners that 40% of the spotted owl habitat had to remain. Well, this gave an incentive to those individuals who had land within that area to cut their trees before their neighbors did. Because if they could hurry up and cut their trees, they could, then the neighbor who had the remaining 40% of good owl habitat would be prevented from cutting his. So it put neighbors in a situation where they had an incentive to hurry up and log off all their trees. There are many examples of just such perverse incentives which have encouraged throughout the West an ethic that some people in the Fish and Wildlife Service refer to as the shoot, shovel, and shut up club. For many landowners, the discovery of an endangered or listed species on their property was viewed as a calamity. And the best alternative, they may feel, is to kill the animal and bury it and shut up about it, and destroy the habitat which attracted it in the first place. So this kind of negative incentive has certainly hurt. When you compare this with some examples of very successful recovery efforts, for example, sponsored by the Audubon Society of building nesting boxes for bluebirds, which was done by millions of Americans around the country, the building of nesting boxes for wood ducks, both of them were very successful non-Endangered Species Act activities, well, which have proved far more successful in the recovery of those species, the wood duck and the bluebird, than anything that we can say within the Endangered Species Act itself. So at any rate, there is this agreement, I think, and we see this, for example, in a report that was completed last summer by the Keystone Group, which is a nonpartisan conflict resolution center in Colorado, which invited members of a number of environmental groups, business community, state, local, federal government representatives, and representatives from various tribes to discuss problems with the Act. And one of their 15 of their conclusions were had to deal with the issue of incentives. There were perverse incentives. There was also the unfortunate situation where you have someone who had already agreed to with the government on a habitat conservation plan for a particular species, and then the government authorities came back to them and said, "Oh, wait, we forgot something. Now we want to redo the agreement." These ugly surprises, as they're sometimes referred to, have been generally recognized as a problem, and the Keystone Group, along with the Clinton administration, and a number of the authors of a number of the bills on the Endangered Species Act reauthorization currently before Congress, all have recognized these as problems and have put forward in their recommendations a list of various strategies, all aimed at providing incentives to landowners to cooperate and to give them an incentive to preserve habitat rather than an incentive to destroy it. And that have built in the so-called no surprises promises on the part of the federal government, and tax breaks, tax incentives, inheritance tax breaks for donations of land or habitat for endangered species, tax breaks for tax deductions for people who spend money to improve their habitat for endangered species, and so on. And in addition, a recognition of another aspect of the disincentive, that often the Act tends to hurt the small landowner the most. The large corporations, such as the Weyerhaeuser Corporation, which owns a great deal of land, can afford to enter into an agreement with the federal government for a habitat conservation plan, for example, where they may set aside thousands of acres in order to be allowed to cut thousands of other acres. That sort of arrangement isn't open to the small landowner. And a number of the recommendations that I've seen now in the Keystone Group, the Clinton administration, and others are directed at trying to achieve a little bit more social justice here by either giving the Secretary of the Interior more flexibility in working out plans for the management of these small parcels, or exempting landowners who have the Clinton administration's plan, exempting landowners who own 5 acres or less from some of the provisions of the Act. The Keystone Group goes farther and thinks that small landowners, for example, should not have to go through the complete environmental impact statement process, because this is horrendously expensive, and in fact it's far too expensive for the average small landowner to survive. These are the kinds of, this is the kind of thinking that we see increasingly applied, and I think in a constructive way, indicating to administer the Act in a more flexible and more humane way, but also in a way that is more effective, because it gives the people who live next to these plants and animals an incentive to protect them, or to actually to enhance their habitat rather than to diminish it or to destroy it. Now, having said that, I'd say that what we do not see, and I think this is where the next round of discussion is going to lie, deals with the goals of the Endangered Species Act and with other preservation laws possible as well. When I was working on my most recent book, I had a discussion with a fellow who became a friend of mine over the purpose of the course of my writing the book, who was one of the authors of the Endangered Species Act, old-time fellow in the Fish and Wildlife Service, and was head of the then three-person office of the Office of Endangered Species in 1972 and 73 when the current law was written. And I asked him, what was the purpose of the act? And he said, well, to save endangered species. And I said, yes, I know, but why? Now, what was in your mind? Was it because the biodiversity provides potentially valuable genetic information which could be valuable for us, for example, for curing diseases? Was it because you believe that biodiversity is an intrinsic value? What's the reasoning behind it? And he said, well, in my 30 years in Washington, no one's ever asked that question. And that's true, that the act, when it was written as laws tend to be written in response to direct pressures, concern about specific plants and animals, and a desire to do something, a legitimate desire to do something about it. But it does raise the question of what our goals are here. This question, for example, came up a few years ago when the Blue Ribbon Panel established by the National Parks and Conservation Association, so-called Blue Ribbon Panel, attempted to define the purposes of the national parks, and it defined those purposes, the management, as the preservation or restoration of the biotic assemblages that existed or would have existed had Columbus not discovered America. And you think about that, would have existed had Columbus not discovered America. Well, of course, that's a non-goal. It's because there's no way of knowing what those conditions are. A philosopher would put it by saying you can't verify a counterfactual conditional any more than you can say what it's like telling the Governor Chirac of France that he must manage France as it would have evolved had Napoleon won the Battle of Waterloo. We are still tend to look to not look at the actual goals here that we're trying to achieve. And what we see in the case of the Endangered Species Act and in the other laws is a tendency to believe that what we're trying to achieve is somehow to restore some pre-Columbian conditions. And in any case, to maintain certain conditions in some kind of a relatively unchanging state. As a consequence, there tends to be a bias in the part of the U.S. preservation policy towards maintaining and enhancing those biological communities which exhibit less change, which tend to be what biologists sometimes refer to as late successional or climax communities. It's based on the assumption that prior to the coming of European settlement, the biological communities in America experienced relatively little disturbance, that humans played no insignificant ecological role in the evolution of the plants and animals, or at any rate, the creation of the biological communities as they were when European settlers encountered them. This is therefore to dismiss the biological role, the ecological role that the Native Americans played in shaping the landscape of North America, which a mountainous amount of evidence indicates now was extremely profound. Many plants and animals require disturbance, particularly require fire, for example. The carnauba butterfly, which is on the list, requires it. The silver spot butterfly requires it. The black-capped vireo in Texas requires disturbed habitat. So ironically, one of the effects of the Act and of other environmental laws, such as the Wilderness Area Act, has been to encourage late successional plant and animal communities which benefit certain creatures, the creatures which require that kind of habitat, but harm others. What this indicates to me is we have in effect a monolithic preservation policy aimed at biodiversity, aimed at diversity, which in fact seems to me to be somewhat of a contradiction. We should be recognizing that we need far more flexible management techniques. Now, as I go around the country and talk with biologists who are actively engaged, particularly in saving a lot of plants, they all point out this is indeed a problem. There's also a problem with the overabundance of certain species, because we've assumed that if we simply let nature take its course, that everything's going to be all right. And in fact, we let nature take its course, and we find in certain areas that there's an overabundance of deer or elk, which are really doing a job on a lot of rare plant species and also on the habitat of other animals. So the policy of assuming that preservation of habitat alone and leaving it alone will solve the problems of biodiversity simply is not working. Preservation of habitat, first of all, is a necessary but not sufficient condition for the survival of all creatures, because some have gone too far, or there is not sufficient habitat left. But in addition, and they therefore may require supplemental captive breeding techniques or something of that kind. But in addition, in some cases, what we need to do is to make more habitat, and that is actively engage in activities such as prescribed burning. So what I want to leave you with is the idea that I think we're going to see as the next generation of the first debate this next year is going to be over means, not ends. But ultimately, I think we're going to see more, and I hope we'll see more constructive debate over the question of ends here. Do we really want a preservation policy that ignores the real biological needs of plants and animals which require disturbance, for example, that require more active intervention by humans in order for them to be saved? I've run out of time. I want to thank you very much.
As is the tradition, is this on? As is the tradition at our forum events, we invite our audience to come to the two microphones that are stationed on each side and open some discussion between the panel and the audience. Yes.
Yeah, I wanted to address a question to Mr. Chase. I've always been a little concerned when I've heard the arguments, and I've heard them in Mann and Plummer's book, Noah's Choice, that since the passage of the Endangered Species Act, only one species or two species have been delisted, when we really haven't set that up against any particular expectation. If we have a continuing downward spiral in different species populations and numbers, I don't see why we would have expected that within 20 years we would have, quote unquote, saved certain species. And it seems to me that by making this argument, what you're doing is putting a perverse incentive on the Fish and Wildlife Service to delist too early. So that if we can say that, well, whooping crane populations have recovered, we've seen them go straight down, and then, well, actually it started before the Endangered Species Act, but since the time that people have been concerned about recovery of whooping cranes, we've seen the population stabilize and then rise, but certainly not to the point where we feel comfortable delisting them. Still, the stabilization and rise of those populations have to be viewed as something to be happy about, and we must give credit to the Endangered Species Act when that happens. And if we say, in order to justify the Endangered Species Act, we have to see more delistings, it seems to me you're putting a perverse incentive on the Fish and Wildlife Service to do something like that.
Well, as Plummer, Mann, and others have pointed out, it's not merely a matter of delistings. It's also by other measures, too. Those listing those which have been improving, their condition has been improving, as opposed to those whose condition has not been improving. By any of the indices that you take, the numbers are not good. Now, as I pointed out, you're absolutely right. As I pointed out, one could argue that the condition could be much worse if there had been no act, and there's no way of proving that. There's no way of proving that point. But I think, nevertheless, we are looking at now a rapidly accelerating listing of species. Certainly according to the GAO in 1988 and the Interior Department IG a few years later, the service is pretty much overwhelmed right now. For example, 60% of species don't even have a recovery plan. This is before there was this enormous, this big new flood, which we're now experiencing of listing. So we have to find a way to make the law work better. I think that one way certainly is to decouple more than has been the listing process from the recovery process, and then provide more flexibility in the recovery process. One problem is that because the Act in fact applies what Plummer and Mann call the NOAA principle, that attempt to save everything, since what that means in effect is that the Fish and Wildlife Service applies various value systems for prioritizing, and generally speaking, those priorities are perverse. So the creatures that get the most money are not necessarily those most at risk, but those, it's more of a political reaction where you might say the squeaky wheel gets the grease. The grizzly bear and the northern spotted owl have gotten a lion's share of the money in recent years, and neither of them are even endangered.
Professor Wilson, earlier before you came out to make these remarks, you indicated that you thought the debate was about a clash between two basic American values. On the one side, the protection of our precious ecosystems, and on the other side, the protection of private property. I'm surprised at the way that this conversation has turned. It seems as if the debate is more about protecting one set of species over another. What happened to the private property debate?
The private property debate, I think, was partly covered by Mr. Chase when he spoke about incentives. I've had the privilege in the last year of consulting with Mr. Gingrich with a small group of specialists, and which he is attempting, in fact, to find a win-win situation. In case that surprises you, Mr. Gingrich, I think, would very much like to see a strong Endangered Species Act. That is one that takes care of the other concern that was particularly so rampant in the early part of the current Congress. And in addition to what Mr. Chase has mentioned, there are many other incentives that can be explored, I think, which in combination can provide the kind of release and the lessening of anxiety that we indicated. Another one, for example, is the swapping of federal lands. Swapping a piece of federal land that has little value with reference to endangered species and valuable ecosystems for a piece of private land that does have those values as a hotspot. And this might occur upon the initiation of either the Department of Interior or the landowner, or it might be instigated by the desire of the landowner to develop that property, to cut forest on it or sell it to a developer. There are many other such incentives, I think, that are being explored, and I hope that they will provide a context for a more rational discussion down the line when the subject of the Endangered Species Act comes along. Moreover, let us not overlook technological advances and understanding of ecosystems as they actually are that are rapidly improving. There is, in conjunction with the recognition of hotspot mapping, the identification of the hotspots where these endangered species tend to be concentrated. They don't just occur at random across the landscape, as I pointed out in that one slide. They tend to be concentrated in critical ecosystems like the rainforest of Hawaii or the Edwards aquifer and the freshwater systems of the southeast United States, such that when we have the kind of information sufficiently detailed about our biota to do the maps of these areas, of these hotspots in the critical ecosystems, they can be that information can be stored and processed rapidly by new techniques in geographic information systems, and then digital overlays of other databases that are concerned with human needs and development will allow an overall picture in which I think more rational solutions can be reached, combined with those incentives that we talked about. This is one I think the American people can work their way out of, and protect both of those sacred values.
Let me take the moderator's prerogative and just ask Dr. Chase. I know you have some slightly different views about the role of science and making some of these policy decisions. Perhaps you'd like to respond to the last remarks.
I think that I am troubled by, I might begin by mentioning there is one proposed bill for reauthorization of the Act by Dirk Kempthorne in the Senate, which would decouple the question of ecosystems from the Endangered Species Act. As the Endangered Species Act is now written, it states that its purpose is to maintain the ecosystems on which endangered and threatened species depend. And Senator Kempthorne would like to remove that language from the Act and instead raise the whole question of ecosystems management as a separate issue for federal policy. I think this makes a lot of sense because what we see now is by executive action, the ecosystems management has now been adopted by every land management agency. And in most cases, the people in the agency and the agencies themselves don't know what the term means. They have the spirited discussions and debates about it, and I find being asked by many people within the Forest Service and the Park Service that would come to me and say, gee, we are now told that we are supposed to imply ecosystems management. What is it? The problem is that ecosystems term is itself ambiguous. Certainly the way it's being used within the federal planning has been ambiguous. And it's often, often you find language in which, for example, you find this with respect to the Clinton administration's plans out in the Pacific Northwest for the Upper Columbia River Basin and others. They state that the purpose of the act is to maintain the plan for that area is to maintain ecosystem stability or ecosystem resiliency. And in virtually every case, these terms are defined in a circular way. They come back to saying, well, what is resiliency? Well, it's capacity to come back to a condition of stability. What's stability? Well, it's integrity. And there is, in fact, implicit in a lot of these uses is a teleological idea, and that is the idea that to understand nature is to understand how things ought to behave in order to maintain the system in a given state or within a given set of parameters. And this notion leads itself to the supposition that the purpose of government here is to not protect, in fact, it was explicitly stated in the National Performance Review of the EPA a year and a half ago, where they stated that hitherto the purpose of the EPA was to maintain and protect public health. Now we realize this purpose is too narrowly defined and that the goal of the EPA should be to protect ecosystem stability from the man-made stressors that threaten it. The term stability is not defined, but in any case, this is a teleological notion. This is a supposition that government can say what we ought to desire, and it can put experts in the position of authority in suggesting this is telling the the farmer, as Plummer and Mann pointed it out, or put it, turned the scientists working for the government into ecological mandarins who can tell a farmer where to plant every fence post. I'd like to see the whole debate get back to one of public choice. The value of biodiversity is one value among many values which are competing for the interests of the American people. And the American people ultimately need to make the decision. It should not be decisions that are made for them by land management agencies or by biologists.
I'm going to try and break tradition and keep my question brief and simply ask Professor Wilson, given a certain amount of or a small amount of political reality, what would be your picture of a good Endangered Species Act or good Habitat Preservation Act?
I'd just like to, before I address that, which I will do very imperfectly, I'd like to make a response to Mr. Chase. The idea, the definition of ecosystems, the limitation of ecosystems, the concepts of stability, of equilibrium are not teleological. They are precisely defined. They are well worked out in the recent scientific literature, and they are easily available and explainable to the public at large. And I think that clearly makes education a priority. Now, as to the as to what I would see as a good Endangered Species Act, I frankly find Mr. Kempthorne's idea of uncoupling ecosystems from species kind of dumb. It seems to me that the ecosystems comprising species, many of which are linked to one another in food webs, and other forms of ecological interactions on which their existence depends, that these should be considered together, and that this is not a counterproductive procedure in attempting to enlist the best methods of science and technology, carefully explained to the public, carefully entered into the public debate as this discussion goes on, that this is the way to create a strong ecosystems, a strong Endangered Species Act, to refigure it. And it would seem to me that in collateral moves, that there should be wide-ranging exploration of the techniques or the methods and legislative provisions that have been mentioned by Mr. Chase and which I've mentioned, so as to take a good deal of the fire out of the controversy, as this subject, which is has a large scientific and technological component, is rationally explored.
Hi, my name is Amara Tandy. I'm an undergraduate at the college. My question, I guess, is mostly for Mr. Chase. I'm sure you're pretty familiar with the debate over return of timber wolves to Yellowstone and other areas, and it's been seen by a lot of people as a microcosm of the larger debate over whether or not to prioritize species or the Old West type thing, the landowner versus biodiversity question. But I'm wondering if maybe in light of the recent sort of successes with the recent reintroduction, if maybe the way we've seen that as a microcosm has been wrong. It's been seen as a small version of the larger power struggle between the different interest groups, but I'm wondering if, in light of the recent initiatives such as the Wolf Compensation Fund by Defenders of Wildlife and the success in that of lowering tension and that sort of thing, if maybe we should see it as a way in which the different groups could start to look at each other's interests rather than looking at their positions, because you're suggesting that we might have a more useful dialogue going on in Congress coming up soon, and we have the proponents of biodiversity saying that only a very small number of landowners, not much monetary value is being affected by the Endangered Species Act. Well, it seems like in light of what the Wolf Compensation Fund has done, maybe we should put our money where our mouths are. Or if we're not willing to put our money where our mouths are, maybe that means that we don't really believe that that effect is that small. And I'm wondering if you think that sort of dialogue is likely in the coming debate. And I don't know, it's a sort of suggestion I thought might be useful.
Well, that's a good, interesting set of questions. I don't know whether I'm not terribly optimistic that the wolf issue is ever going to be debated very rationally. But of course, I've been favored wolf reintroduction to Yellowstone ever since I wrote Playing God in Yellowstone. However, I do see that the issue has been usually misrepresented, by both sides. Canis lupus eremotus, which was the wolf that was in Yellowstone, is now extinct. So we're now reintroducing another cousin of it from Canada. But I think it is a good example of where we think we're restoring something, but we're not. Nature and natural history never repeats itself. We're creating historically unique conditions, not just with the wolves, but that's happened with the mountain lions and with deer and many of the other major mammals in the West. What's interesting about the wolf issue, in a way, it's kind of irrelevant, because every biologist I've talked to suggests that if no wolves were reintroduced, brought down from Canada by the Fish and Wildlife Service to Yellowstone, that wolves would colonize the area anyway, so long as they are protected. As several biologists put it to me, the only question is whether they'll stop when they get to Mexico. So wolf reintroduction, I think, is a kind of irrelevant issue. I think the more interesting question is just where do we want wolves and where do we not want wolves? After all, if you look at it technically, I suppose wolf restoration would require returning wolves to Manhattan Island. But I don't think anyone's going to seriously propose that. Nevertheless, we are going to have to ask, do we want wolves in the suburbs of Denver? Do we want mountain lions in the suburbs of Denver, where we already have them? That as these animals are protected, particularly, we'll say the mountain lion, because of the explosion of deer, there's been an explosion of mountain lion populations in many states along the Rocky Mountain front, and they have become increasingly hazardous to human beings. I'm not saying wolves will become hazardous to human beings, but they certainly could become hazardous to livestock. And now we come back to another question, which is, again, the Keystone Group raised it, and so has the Clinton administration, and that is that should we expect some people to pay the costs of something that is identified as a national good here, which is, let's say, wolf recovery. If we want wolf recovery, then should we depend on the defenders of wildlife to I think not. I think that the taxpayer should be willing to say, yes, well, let's put into a plan that would the taxpayers would compensate ranchers for stock losses due to wolf predation.
Hi, my name is Henry Barbaro. I'd like to direct this to Professor Wilson. In your book, Diversity of Life, you mention the impacts of human population growth on endangered species, extinction of species. And this is, I guess, in the context of the Endangered Species Act, you really can't, I don't expect the United States government to legislate, population issues. But I'm just curious, kind of philosophically, from your point of view, in your research, how the correlation between human population growth and loss of species and endangered species and their impacts. And just to maybe give you a focal point, for example, China, being the most populous country in the world, does that have a corresponding greatest rate of species extinction and highest number of endangered species, that sort of thing? Just curious your thoughts.
It's a very broad-range question, and I'll try to answer it briefly. China has very serious problems. For example, the next two mammals, great mammals, to go extinct may be Chinese. The Yangtze River dolphin, which is down now to about 100 individuals, and the panda, which is down, great panda, down to about 1,000. And that's due almost directly to enormous population pressure. The United States does not appear to be in danger of losing large amounts of its biota as a consequence of projected population growth. Our problem has to do with the subjects that are being discussed here tonight, having to do with land use policy and increasing our knowledge of our own biota, and then developing rational policies, in the political arena. We can do it. American development need not be seriously impacted by a very strong preservationist policy. We are blessed with not having an overly dense population. There are other countries like Ecuador and Madagascar in which the population problem is especially menacing to wildlife and to the fauna and flora, because there you have major hotspots, huge reservoirs of endemic biodiversity that are being pushed back swiftly by deforestation and habitat destruction as a consequence of rapid population growth and poverty. And rather than just say, well, that's a problem, maybe we should do something about it, in fact, lots and lots of people are now concentrating on these problems and trying to figure out ways of doing things about it. They will include a more focused and environmentally conscious form of foreign aid, of perhaps World Bank lending policy, what has already happened in the major conservation organizations of the world, like the World Wildlife Fund, the combining of NGO activities, that is the shifting of NGO activities to a combination of conservation activity, and local economic development. There just has to be more of an effort. Some of these areas are probably, they're full of the walking dead in terms of species. And it's going to be an awful thing to see in the next several decades, masses of species going extinct in places like Ecuador. But in others, a lot can be accomplished, and it requires the shifting of agriculture, the considerable improvement of agriculture, the development of light industry, the encouragement perhaps of movement away from the areas, or incentives provided to move people away from the threatened areas, the use of sustained use of some of these habitats, that is, such as contour strip cutting of forest, the harvesting of natural products, and so on. These are not just ideas that I'm telling you out of the blue. There are libraries now of case studies and technologies and political stratagems to achieve this. They form a large part of the literature that's coming more and more actively in use in foreign policy and in the activities of the international NGOs.
We have time for one or two more questions.
Excuse me. This question is for both speakers. Under a reauthorized Endangered Species Act, do you agree or disagree that we should retain the goal of preventing all species extinctions? And if you agree that we should retain that goal and try and preserve endangered species across the board, how would you suggest that we do this in light of the past failures of the ESA to do so? And if you disagree that we should try and save all species, what species would you suggest that we focus on?
Maybe we don't have time for any more questions.
Well, I would be inclined to favor rewriting the law so that it does not obligate the Secretary of the Interior to save all species, because it cannot be done. In fact, if you take it literally, it does mean an attempt to halt evolution, so it's a quixotic goal. I think that, and this, again, I think there's a growing consensus on this too, that there has to be some language which gives the Secretary of the Interior flexibility in deciding. In some cases, there are species which are already so close to the brink that they cannot be meaningfully rescued, or that there is such a small number and it's such a local population, and the costs involved in dealing with it can be so high in relationship to the benefits that what I might point out is that these decisions are being made anyway. So this would only be to make the act less hypocritical than it is now. So I would suggest, yes, and again, the Keystone Group, I believe, has suggested this, and I believe the Clinton administration has suggested something similar, providing the Secretary of the Interior with some discretion here.
Would you go on and say what you mean by halting evolution?
I mean, halting all extinctions.
Halting all extinctions. Do you know what the average extinction rate is per species without human interference?
Well, is it about 1 per year?
It is 1 per 1 million to 1 per, is 1 species per million species to 10 million species per year. 10 to the minus 6 to 10 to the minus 7. So my response would be the death of species is not, it occurs, but it is not due to species senescence. It is due to the fact that they have been pushed to the brink, and in the vast majority of cases, pushed to the brink by human action. I would like to suggest that we consider an absolute precept to try to preserve all species, to save all species, and then see what it's going to cost us before we just surrender and say, well, let's do a cost-benefit analysis and a tri-age and see if we can't work this out politically with all parties sitting in to discuss the value of species.
What was that number again?
The number of species that go extinct did before the coming of humanity. In between the major species extinction was, the extinction rate was 10 to the minus 6 to 10 to the minus 7. That is 1 species out of 1 million per year, to 1 species out of 10 million per year, depending on the group.
Well, that's about what I said, isn't it?
No, you said 1 per year.
Well, 1 out of the, you said 1 out of 10 million per year, and you
Yes.
say there are 100 million.
Oh, I see what you mean. Okay, you said 1 year, 1 for the whole world per year.
Yes.
That's what you said.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I apologize.
Yes.
So with that in mind, then we are in agreement with what I just said. Okay, thank you.
Well, I'm afraid we're going to have to end on apparently a note of agreement, which no one anticipated, but we will bring this to a close. We thank you both very much for being here, and a very interesting program. Thank you.